Warm welcome to our session on remote learning in education. I, Dr. Reni Francis, Principal, MESS Pillai College of Education and Research, Chembur, welcome each one of you to this session on remote learning in education. The word itself, remote learning. Don't get confused by the word remote. It is not the TV remote that we had in the hand to watch all the TV shows and the serials or the soaps or the other aspects. But remote means you're talking about being distanced by space. You are at a distance. You are not in the same avenue or the purview of the classroom that you usually consider with respect to learning. When we speak about a regular classroom, we see the hustle bustle in the classroom. We see the lot of talking, and we see a lot of activities in the classroom, and we feel, oh, this classroom is really an engaging classroom. But does it mean that the physical space in the classroom will only help in learning, in achieving the learning outcomes? Not necessary. Today, classrooms have moved beyond the expectations of the educator, of the schools, of the learner. Classrooms have become more closer to the heart and to the space that the learner wants to achieve. So, here, when we are talking about classrooms being remote, we are not just moving it far away, but we are getting it nearer to the learner. We are bringing it more closer to the learner so that the learner has an opportunity to has a say, has an equal positioning in the classroom, though the learner may not be available in the physical space of learning. So here we are speaking or we are trying to learn more about remote learning in education. So what is remote learning? Remote learning, it provides an opportunity for the learner and for the students. That is the learner and the students and the educator to remain connected and engaged with the content while working from their homes or different learning spaces. So you do not have a physical classroom to be here, but you have a learning space where you all are connected in the same domain and enjoying the learning domains and enjoying the various aspects of learning those concepts. Opportunities for remote learning are typically in times of an emergency situation or in times of where the learners cannot be uh, pulled in at a single point of time, at a particular point of time due to physical constraints. So we cannot pull in the resources at that one point of time. That's when remote learning really makes it go and reach across the boundaries and take up the learning spaces, not to be trying to be away from the learning, but be engaged in the learning. Transitioning to remote learning, we have all moved. We have seen the transition to remote learning during the COVID. And transitioning to remote learning can keep students on track so that they are able to return to the physical school environment whenever there is an offshoot or whenever there's a uh, provision to meet. They will not be totally unaware of the situation because the learning has really been able to communicate a lot of things during the absence in the physical classroom. So many of the requirement of a traditional classrooms are met through the remote learning, and the learning environment has also become a space where the outcomes or the learning outcomes has been dutifully delivered and seen that the achievement is being taken in its fullest sense. So when we talk about learning, it refers to the educational activities that it has a variety of formats and methods, most of which takes place online. There are a number of options for communicating with students, collaborating, and distributing of educational material. So when we are talking about the learning, the structure of the learning environment or structure of remote learning is the most important aspect that helps the learning remote learning to be more advantageous or to be more fruitful. The most significant elements of this type of learning include the time, the communication, technology, and the learning design. That is the learning lesson plan that we have. The structure of remote learning will determine the success the students and teachers have in the learning process. Their experiences will talk about how effective this structure has become when they are trying to deliver the content the experiences, the activities, which helps the learner to be more engaged in the learning process. Often, at times, we may see the remote learning is evoked during a time of stress where it is not possible for the learner to be there at time. But making the learning engaging can make the learner to be more involved in the learning and can help the learner to contribute the maximum in the learning process. So if the structure of the learning process is not well defined, is not catered well, or is not looked into by looking at the learning gaps, by looking at the learning outcomes, the structure may fail, which will not help in a fruitful learning. Hence, to understand the components of a remote learning, it's important to focus on the structure. Let's take these structures one by one as we see. The first structure, let's take the first structure as time as one of the element of the learning process. Time is the first thing that schools need to consider or educational institutions need to consider because it sets expectations and boundaries for the students and teachers for a prescribed period of time. So when does the school start, or when does this education institution start? When does it end? How many hours that we have to have dedicated time to be given for learning is something that you need to understand when you are creating the remote learning, the format or the structure. Because if you are not going to have a proper time zone or a limit, it will be just way beyond. It will just extend beyond and you may not be able to achieve the learning outcomes that you have really planned for. So the time is very important concept when we are talking about the structure. First and foremost, teachers should define a set of time period throughout the day where they should be made available to the students. So if the teachers have do not prescribe a time that they are ready to be available to the students, then the students will find that there is a lack of communication, or there is wastage of time. So they should make their timetables very systematic so they are able to meet to the needs of the students. It should also be that sometimes the students want to meet the teachers in the real time scenario, so provisions for that also can be done. They should also have opportunities for Zoom or Skype or WhatsApp or Teams, any kind of mode that can be used for the learning process. The next element that you need to consider for remote learning is communication. We know that communication is the biggest forte that we need to focus when we are trying to convey the message from one person to another person. We have the different forms of communication. We have the verbal, non-verbal. And when we are communicating, every verbal or non-verbal, you know, the way that we share makes a lot of impact on the makes a lot of impact on the receiver. So the sender and the receiver, the channels of communication, the sender and the receiver should always be in the same page, on the same page when we are talking about communication. So communication is very, very important and it has to be very clearly determined in the remote learning experience. We have to first understand, first aspect is we are in a remote learning space, which means we are not in the physical real world situation. If we are not there, then our communication should be such that it clarifies maximum data or maximum data points rather than having a lot of confusion or some kind of miscommunication. To avoid that, there should be a very detailed and well planned communication aspect that we should look into. Students should know how exactly they are expected to communicate with the teacher. So there are few norms and standards that we need to follow and practice when we are talking about communication, because only then we'll be able to achieve at a fruitful learning experience or a learning exposure. Whether the student should send an email or whether they should write it during the session, or is a voice note possible, or it should be marked to all, or is it only to the teacher, which kind of technology they are using, which tool they should communicate. If one tool is not working, then what is the other medium to communicate? what is the backup for this communication? Everything has to be very clear. So each question should be answered in an introduction document so that all the expectations are met. So when the teacher is sharing the communication aspect, the teacher should be very clear on what are the expectations by the students on a particular way of communication or the medium of communication or the mode of communication. The next element that we need to decide or think about in the structure of a remote learning is technology. Technology can vary and it is very impromptu. It's a very impromptu remote learning environment. If schools allow students to take some devices at home, it can be from home. If they feel that the devices can be brought from home, BYOD, bring your own device to the school, they can do that. Schools do not have enough devices, then they can ask the students to check those things back at home, flipped learning. So it is a very, very impromptu decision that the can be taken, and the schools or the educational institutions have to provide clear information on how to access online platform, or move to an online platform, especially in remote learning, because there are few considerations that have to be looked into with respect to accessing your content, with respect to getting the resources to you to help your learning process to be more fruitful. There should be also a decorum or a discipline that should be followed with respect to the continuity or regularity of your access to the resources that are provided. If the information is provided by the teacher at a particular period of time, you cannot, as a student, you cannot access it at a very, very later time when the deadlines have already been met. So there is a time frame that has to be met also when we are talking about accessing the information. So clear information describing steps for troubleshooting or for contact information or for technical support also needs to be mentioned when we are talking about technology as an element for structure of the remote learning. The next aspect that we need to consider for the structure of remote learning is a learning design. That is, a learning designing your lesson design. That is how you're going to design your lesson plan. So, designing a lesson plan for remote learning is a little bit more detailed because it needs to understand various aspects what you are going to deal with when you're teaching at any point of time. One is you need to understand what are your learning outcomes that you need to achieve, how are you going to achieve it, what are the ways that you are going to implement your lesson, and how are you going to take the assessment. So a typical remote lesson plan will have these following components that will help you to understand whether your lesson that you have designed is suitable to meet the needs of a learner in a remote learning environment. So, first is you need to look at the setting up of the lesson. The setting the lesson is providing the context for the lesson, which will be linked to their previous knowledge or the previous lessons that they have learned. So, while doing this, you need to understand how you're going to set up the lesson, how you're going to meet the needs of the learner by connecting them from the previous knowledge to the current knowledge and taking them to a future knowledge. So, they will be doing through certain questions, demonstrations, images, pictures on variety of modes that can be done. The next is you are defining your learning objectives or your learning outcomes. While you're defining your learning outcomes in a remote, as well as in a face to face, or it can be even in your remote, the objectives need to be written, well defined. You cannot have multiple objectives at one time. You need to well define your objectives so that the student knows or the teacher knows what is it you are going to get at the end of the lesson. So here, when we are talking about it is the action of the learning or of the outcome. There is a behavioral action that will be demonstrated after the student achieves the learning. So that behavioral action should be defined very clearly when you're talking about defining the learning outcomes, even in a remote learning situation. Then the next is access of it's to how to assess the current understanding. So when you're talking about assessing the current understanding, We need to look at the various aspects of current understanding. That is, you need to check through polls, or you need to check through some questions, or you need to check through some aspects that will lead the questions into various learning processes. And then it will help the learner to understand or what is the question that is posed in front of the learner, the teacher to understand whether the learning is being complemented or accepted or achieved the way the teacher had intended to achieve. So you need to take polls or checklist or questions or certain opinions. This will be helping the student to be in the line of the learning process, not to get distracted. To regular questions will help the learner to be at par of the learning standards that needs to be achieved, and also to be familiar with the process of the lesson. The next that we need to understand is how to introduce the content that we need to take in the class. So once you have given them the previous knowledge, you have stated the objectives, then you are talking about how you need to connect, or how you will be connected with the learner. You need to now deliver the content, but you can deliver the content either through an explanation, through a story, through a video, through some kind of probing questions, developmental questions, which will make the students respond to that. A related incident can be shared. A related incident based on that certain questions which can be covered. Through this, the content is delivered to the student, and this content is now taken it based on the various teaching points that the teacher wants to deliver. And this teaching points has been taken in by the students. They are able to understand the concept that they are going to achieve, and this learning processes can be also interspersed with certain questions, discussions, some kind of dialogues, and some kind of interaction or exchange of thoughts by the teacher and the students, as well as the group that was formed for the learning process. Once they are done with it, then you need to assess the application. So you are now going to assessment. You're going to go move to the next step of assessment. Assessment can be done when you are giving them or assigning them an application activity. Remember, this application activity is linked to your learning outcome, which you have written or mentioned earlier, which states the behavioral action that you can witness the student to perform in assessing the document or in assessing the content. So you will assign a content, you will assign an act. You have taught the content, you will assign an activity, and based on the assignment of the activity, the child is going to perform, and based on the performance, you will be able to assess the mastery of the content or the concept achievement. So this process has to be also very clearly defined by the teacher when they are providing this situation to the learner. So when you are talking about this as a situation, we need to understand that there are a lot of aspects that we take up when we are talking about the learning process. There are a lot of aspects that we have to remember when we are talking about the learning process, because the transition by the teacher should be easy as possible for the student and the teacher to be on the same page, because you are in a remote learning situation. You are in a place where you are not uh, there is not there you are not in a face to face position. So there are instances, maybe you may lose the track, and there may be many other aspects that are involved, but at this point of time you should be able to be on the same page, and hence there should be a very clearly stated objectives that are mentioned, which will help the teacher to be in track through the learning process, which will enable the learner to help to understand that these are the learning outcomes that I need to achieve through the behavioral objectives or the behavioral action that will be demonstrated. And there should be an accessible language that is consistent with the text to meet to the needs of the learner. So there is a communication that has to be developed. Like we said, time is an aspect, communication is an aspect that needs to be developed, and also technology. So when you have these things coming in its place, the time the time it will take for a student to complete a lesson will vary. and depends on the grade level or the subject and the teacher. So there is no, the teacher is the person who prepares this lesson design, and this lesson design is based on the content that he or she has to deliver to a particular grade of student. And with this grade of student, what subject it is and what is the level of concept, level of understanding that the student has to achieve to perform the assessment, to perform the assigned activity. So it may vary with different students, different classes, different subjects. So activities and assignments should have a clear direction, and sample should be provided so that they are able to do it better. A rubric is helpful at this point of time to see how much. So it is not just achievement or non-achievement, but the level of achievement can be understood, which will help us to understand, some kind of a checklist, or so the level of achievement can be understood. And it will always help when you are finishing the lesson, the ending up of a lesson with a reflective question allows the student to reflect how their learning was, how their experience was, and these valuable feedback will help in improving the lesson design. So, to conclude this aspect of remote learning, I would like to say that transitioning to remote learning can keep students on track so that when they return to the physical school environment, they will not need to complete a lot of work to be ready for any scheduled assessments. Many of the requirements in a traditional classroom environment will be in play for remote learning environments, and the goal is to adhere to as many state and local requirements as possible. So, when you are at this point of juncture where you're talking about how learning can be more accessible, how learning can be more effective, how learning can be more engaging, I think remote learning is a solution. Like we looked into virtual learning and remote learning, helps us to build the learning spaces, the learning situation more favorable to the student, more favorable to the educator to make the learning more fruitful, engaging, and interactive. So I hope you enjoyed this session and stay connected. Thank you for listening.